The sun had just begun to set over Charlotte, North Carolina, casting a soft orange glow over the city. The light rail train was packed with commuters, their faces tired from a day's work, eyes glazed over as the train rattled along the tracks. The soft hum of the train's engine mixed with the faint murmur of conversations and the occasional beep of a cell phone. It was an ordinary evening on the tracks. That was until something broke the monotony. Iryna Zarutska, a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee, was seated near the back of the train. She had been living in the U.S. for just over a year, working 2 jobs to send money back to her family in Kyiv. A soft-spoken, determined young woman, Iryna had dreams of building a new life in a country she thought would offer safety and opportunity. But that night, on a seemingly routine ride home, her life would come to a violent and senseless end. It was just after 8 p.m. when the surveillance cameras captured the chilling moment. A man dressed in a black hoodie and dark jeans approached Iryna from behind. He moved swiftly, without any hesitation, and in a single swift motion, he stabbed her in the back. The blade, sharp and unforgiving, sank deep into her chest. Iryna's body jerked forward, her scream drowned out by the noise of the train. Passengers froze in shock, their faces filled with horror as they realized what was happening. The attacker didn't even pause to check if his victim was alive. He turned and fled the scene, disappearing into the night. The train screeched to a halt as it reached the next station. Panic set in. People scrambled to get off, but no one moved towards the back where Iryna lay slumped in her seat. Her life was slipping away as blood pooled on the floor beneath her. It wasn't until a passenger finally got the courage to approach her that they saw the gravity of the situation. They screamed for help. Cliffhanger. Just when it seemed like the case was going cold, a breakthrough came. The police found something that would change everything. A hidden camera, positioned just above the train platform. The footage it captured was shaky, unclear, but in the blur, they saw something familiar, someone familiar, a face they had seen before. But when they dug deeper into the suspect's background, what they found shocked everyone. The discovery of the hidden camera in the train station sent shockwaves through the investigation. It wasn't the typical breakthrough investigators had been hoping for, but it was enough to reignite the hunt for Iryna Zarutska's killer. What was once an inexplicable, random murder had suddenly become more deliberate. The suspect wasn't just a stranger. He was someone the investigators might have missed altogether, if not for the small, shaky piece of footage that had slipped through the cracks. The grainy video showed the man walking briskly through the crowd, his hood pulled tight over his head. The train station was busy, full of commuters going about their evening routines, yet somehow this man blended in perfectly. The police had no idea who he was, but the more they looked, the more familiar he seemed. They ran the footage through facial recognition software, hoping for a match, but it came up empty. No criminal records, no ties to any known gangs, and no history of violence. The man wasn't on any watch lists, but then a breakthrough came when a single name surfaced in a secondary investigation. Detective Laura Owens, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in Charlotte's most violent cases, had been working tirelessly to connect the dots. She had a hunch that there was more to this case than just a random act of violence. As the investigation deepened, she looked at the suspect's possible ties to local unsolved assaults. It was a long shot, but Owens didn't believe in coincidences. Then it hit her. There had been a series of similar attacks reported on the city's transit system. The assaults had never escalated to murder, but there were patterns. Women who appeared vulnerable, alone at night, were targeted without any clear provocation. Some victims described a man with a hoodie, others reported an unremarkable face, just a shadow that lurked in the dark corners of their vision. At first, the incident seemed isolated, but now, with Iryna's murder on the table, everything started to fit. The suspect wasn't a random killer, he was a predator. Someone who had been preparing for this moment, someone who knew exactly how to blend in, how to slip in and out of people's lives unnoticed. But why Iryna? Why had he escalated from harassment to cold-blooded murder? Owens and her team dug into the personal details of Iryna's life, trying to see if there was anything that connected her to the man on the train. But there was no history between them, no previous run-ins, and no obvious reason why she had become the target. But as the investigation continued, a troubling theory began to form. This wasn't just about Iryna. It was about something much bigger. Days passed, and the media frenzy grew. Protesters gathered at Charlotte's transit stations, demanding justice for the refugee whose life had been taken so violently. The narrative shifted as people began to discuss the city's crime problem, the rise in violent attacks on public transportation, and the overwhelming sense of insecurity that now plagued commuters. But in the midst of the public outcry, Owens received an anonymous tip. It came through a burner phone, the kind that criminals use to hide their identity. The message was short and chilling. "He's done this before, and he'll do it again." The tip was a clue. Someone knew more. Owens traced the phone to a known street vendor who had recently been arrested for minor offenses, but no connections to anything serious. He was no longer in police custody, but Owens knew his past and the people he had run with. As she dug deeper, she found that the vendor had been involved in a small local gang that had been known to target women. It wasn't a gang known for high-profile crimes, but more for petty thefts and public disturbances. Owens wasn't convinced that the gang had any direct involvement in Iryna's murder. However, there was one member of that crew, someone who had always been a mystery, a man named Caleb Stevens. He had recently gone off the radar, and his whereabouts were unknown. But there was something unnervingly familiar about his past that made Owens uneasy. He had a history of unprovoked violence, and his record was peppered with complaints of stalking and harassing women on the same transit lines where Iryna had been attacked. Detective Owens connected the dots and began digging into Caleb's life. A few months earlier, he had been reported missing by his family, but no one had followed up on the case. Caleb had disappeared just as the attacks had begun escalating in the city. And now, with Iryna's murder, Owens had a theory. Caleb wasn't just a random bystander in these crimes. He was likely the killer. The pattern was undeniable. As Owens and her team hunted down leads to find Caleb, they realized that they were not just searching for a killer, they were racing against time. The attacks were escalating. The pressure mounted. With each passing day, the fear of the unknown killer gripping the city tightened. The stakes were higher than ever. Cliffhanger. But just as they thought they were closing in on Caleb's whereabouts, a new twist rocked the case. A well-placed source in the police department, me forward with disturbing news. Caleb wasn't working alone. The truth about who was really behind the killing was about to explode, and it was more twisted than anyone had anticipated. Detective Owens stood outside the rundown apartment complex, the cold breeze cutting through the city streets. The walls of the building seemed to close in on her, as if the entire structure was hiding its secrets. Caleb Stevens had been elusive, but now, after weeks of tireless investigation, they were closing in on him. But something didn't feel right. There was a growing sense of dread, as if the case was slipping further out of her grasp. The new tip-off had raised the stakes. Caleb wasn't the sole perpetrator. Someone else, someone far more dangerous, had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The tip came from an unexpected source, an informant within the same street gang Caleb had once run with. This informant claimed that Caleb had been working for someone much more dangerous and much higher up the food chain. Owens pressed the informant for details, but all she got were cryptic words that left her with more questions than answers. He's just a pawn in this. Owens couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a single murder. The pattern of attacks on the city's transit system now seemed orchestrated, like a sick game, and Iryna's death was the final, brutal move. But who was behind it? As Owens pushed further into the case, her team began uncovering disturbing connections. Caleb's disappearance hadn't been as sudden as it first appeared. In fact, it was a calculated move. Caleb had gone into hiding after a botched robbery. But what had started as a petty crime spree had evolved into something much darker. A collaboration with powerful figures in the underworld who had manipulated Caleb into targeting women to further some twisted agenda. The more they learned about Caleb's connections, the more Owens realized that this was far from a random act of violence. Someone had been using him as a pawn to create fear in the city, to destabilize the community in a way that no one could have predicted. The violence had been a message all along. But what was the message? And who stood to gain from such fear? Owens had to dig deeper. She and her team scoured every available piece of information on Caleb's movements. Then, a breakthrough came when they found an old phone number linked to Caleb, one that hadn't been used for years. They traced the number back to a name they hadn't expected to see, Alexei Petrov, a former Ukrainian oligarch who had fled to the U.S. a few years prior, after a series of high-profile corruption charges had forced him into hiding. Petrov had once been a powerful figure in the Ukrainian criminal world. He had close ties to extremist groups and had been linked to several underground operations in Europe before fleeing to America under the guise of a refugee. His connections to the Ukrainian underworld were rumored to be extensive, and he had used his wealth to manipulate people from behind the scenes. It now seemed that Petrov had found an ally in Caleb Stevens, a small-time criminal who could carry out his dirty work without raising suspicion. What Owens hadn't realized was that Caleb wasn't just a pawn. He was the perfect vessel for Petrov's operations. Someone with a history of violence, someone with nothing to lose. Caleb had been sent on a mission to terrorize the city's most vulnerable, to sow chaos and fear. Iryna Zarutska had been the last victim in a chain of random, senseless attacks. But when Owens and her team finally tracked down Caleb, they found something that no one could have predicted. Caleb was dead. His body was found in a dumpster behind a strip mall, his throat slit. And the mystery deepened. Who had killed him, and why? The answer came when Owens linked the death back to Petrov. Caleb had grown too bold. He had become a liability to the criminal enterprise, and in a brutal move to cover his tracks, Petrov had silenced him. With Caleb's death, the case was far from over. But now, Owens had a clear understanding of what had really happened. Iryna Zarutska's death had been part of a larger, more sinister operation, a series of random, calculated attacks meant to keep the city in fear. And Petrov, the mastermind behind it all, had escaped once again. Owens knew the case wasn't over. Petrov was still out there, a dangerous figure with deep connections and the power to continue wreaking havoc. The truth behind Iryna's death might have been uncovered, but the war to bring Petrov to justice had only just begun. As Owens stood there, the weight of the case pressing down on her, she realized one thing. Justice wasn't always straightforward. Sometimes, the criminals you're chasing are the ones who are the hardest to catch, the ones who know how to disappear into the shadows. And in the case of Iryna Zarutska, the shadows were still very much alive. Haunting conclusion. Months passed, and while the case against Caleb Stevens had closed, the hunt for Alexei Petrov continued. But the final twist came when Owens discovered something even more disturbing. Petrov had left behind a trail of destruction far wider than anyone could have imagined. Not only had he been behind a string of similar attacks across the country, but the extent of his operations reached into the highest echelons of government. The search for him wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about stopping an international crime network, one that had preyed on the vulnerable, one that still had its claws deeply embedded in American soil. Just as Owens was closing in, she received an anonymous message, "You're too late. The plan has already begun." And just like that, the case that began with Iryna Zarutska's tragic death was far from over. It was only the beginning.